thanks everyone for letting me and my fellow presenters speak to you today about archiving Latinxs on the U.S. Great Plains. Let me introduce you to our presenters. We have Lorindo Weisey, who we can't see up there, but you'll see her in a minute. She's the University Archivist and Digital Repository Manager at the University of Nebraska at Kearney. We also have Wendy Guerra, the Digital Initiatives Archivist at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. Zach Hernandez, here with me, Unit Manager for Field Acquisitions at the Southwest Collection at Texas Tech University, and then me, Robert Weaver, an Archivist at the Southwest Collection as well. So I'm going to talk first for a little bit about the work we've done at the Southwest Collection and sort of the big picture of our resources to address some disparities in our holdings. First, let me say that I don't know what my fellow presenters are going to do, but I'm going to use the term Latino throughout the presentation rather than Latinx or Latino or Hispanic, just for simplicity of speech. But I want everybody to know that we are aware of the ongoing discussion of what term to use and the gendered nature of the Spanish language. So I'm going with Latino. Hope y'all are okay with that. So first, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my region's demography. The county of Lubbock and the surrounding region, the South Plains or the Llano Estacado, is probably around 40% Latino. And I say probably because the census is probably going to give you a much lower number, but the undocumented presence there is very large. Perhaps because of agriculture, perhaps because of other reasons, but it's also very visible if you're paying any attention at all. And Zach and I would argue that it's also a vibrant and essential part not just of the Latino community, but really the culture of the South Plains region now in its entirety. And in point of fact, and we're already well aware of this if you went to the plenary speaker this morning, the ethnic Mexican presence in the area dates to the 1840s for sure. And then if you want to get very actually about it, you'd say it goes back to Coronado's first expedition through the area of the State Plains in the 1540s, and then subsequent missionaries who traveled through the area, although primarily their work, as we know, happened here in New Mexico. Okay, so why am I giving you all this background? Because despite everything that I just described, the presence of these historical and cultural traditions in my archive is not at all proportionally represented. Also, our parent institution is what's known as a Hispanic Serving Institution. We're also a founding member of the Alliance of Hispanic Serving Research Universities. That means we're supposed to be recruiting undergraduate and graduate students of the Hispanic Latino background and also supporting faculty research in that area. So we've got an impetus from a lot of different sides to try to address these disparities. And that's what we did starting back in 2020 as best we could with COVID on towards today. So the first thing we had to figure out is what did we already have, right? If I'm making this claim that we don't have very much. And one thing stood out first, which is our collection of Spanish language newspapers published since the mid-20th century. The most prominent of which is this one here, El Editor. It's still published, but was started by a local businessman, a Brown Beret activist, and a politician named Vidal Aguero, with help from his wife, Olga Aguero. There are some other newspapers in the region, El Seminario, Noticias, the West Texas Hispanic News, but El Editor is by far the most prominent, and we have about 1,400 volumes of it digitized and available online. So we had that good start. We also had readily to hand a very small number of Latino-focused collections, the Aguero's papers, which we've accrued over several decades. The papers of Tabitha Doro, an activist who helped create the local the regional Hispanic Association of Women, was the organizer of our first and subsequent Cesar Chavez marches, and was a participant in other activism. And we have some of these other collections here. But you know what was way more common as we poked around in our stuff is this, something like this. This is a scene from a panaderia, which makes me hungry. Zach found this photo among thousands and thousands of others within our enormous Winston Reeves photograph collection. Reeves was a white photographer that nabbed images of many different subjects from all over our region: ranching, farming, sporting events, cultural activities of all kinds, all that kind of stuff. But this photo appears in the collection without context or relationships to other collections or subjects within the collections that might be documenting the same things, nor was it labeled, aside from this little identification you see at the bottom, seen from the Mexican bakery, 1958. No name of the business, nothing. So what we found here, found in other places, was a history that was partially obscured by being sort of tucked away among larger collections and needing to be brought to light. Another thing we looked through were our oral history collections. We have a massive oral history program totaling probably about 7,000 oral histories that have been conducted since the 1950s. But by our estimation, only about 1% of them were immediately identifiable as Latino. Some would say it was a little bit more, but that's what we agreed on for sure. Now, I don't know if you know about the Bracero program of the 1950s, but many of the Mexican and most likely Central American laborers who came to the Llano Estacado to work in the cotton and agriculture industry didn't participate in any oral histories, right? We have very little perspective from the workers' side of things amongst our oral histories. In fact, we have zero, I would say. So our oral histories were lacking as well. So look, I haven't told you in a broad sense anything you didn't already know about archives today. Maybe even your own archives. To be honest, it's a big conversation right now. But now we knew some of the tools that we had to start to tackle this. And the way we wanted to approach it was primarily building new relationships or recultivating old relationships that had sort of fallen by the wayside there on the Llano. And to do that, a big part of our mindset was shifting from collecting things to actually utilizing the things that we had to sort of surface the materials that were in the archive. And step one was Zach's brainchild, creating an in-person exhibit featuring the newspapers I just mentioned to you. The exhibit was entitled Black and Brown in Print. So I should say really quick, it was called Black and Brown because we've also digitized all of the newspapers published by Lubbock's African American community, but that's not what I'm here to talk about today. I'll tell you about it anytime you want. The Manhattan Heights Times is an example of one of those. They're next to El Noticia. So the idea behind this exhibit was not just showing off what we had, but like I said, building new relationships. So what we worked very hard on was inviting the publishers of these newspapers and their families to the opening reception, and they showed up. Also, several members of Lubbock city government showed up, particularly those that represent these communities, but several others as well. The university and the Texas Tech's Humanities Center got behind this as well, which wound up involving students, professors, and even some university administrators, which was great to see. The press was there. Zach was on the nightly news. It was pretty awesome. But as much as we were happy to show off all of our stuff, what we really wanted was to make our presence as a resource for documenting community history known to these attendees and through these more broadly. And I'll tell you whether that was successful here in a minute. Also, Zach did an exhibit that I love on Poncho Clubs. If you're not familiar with this, it's a Mexican-American take on Santa Claus, focusing on charity and giving. Now, some folks in Lubbock, as we've learned through oral histories, claim they invented it in a barbershop there in town. But folks in Houston and San Antonio say the same, so I'm not going to get into that. But I love this exhibit, and it also appeared on the news and in the newspaper, so it furthered some of those same goals. Another thing we've done is attend community events. Zach's going to talk about that in depth here in our next presentation. But what we wanted to get out there was that we're not just a building nestled deep within the enormous Texas Tech campus, but are real people. Well, some of us with a deep investment in this cause, such as Zach, also one of our other historians, Daniel Sanchez, who really wanted to make sure that these exhibits and its reception reflected who we really are. So in terms of the traditional archival side of things, we also tried to reimagine our digital collection space as something not listed collection by collection or item by item, but instead by aggregations of topics. So there's going to be old hat. I see some people here. I know this is old hat for y'all, but we use DSpace. If you're not familiar with DSpace or DuraSpace, that platform, it's not great at displaying entire collections, right? But it's great at displaying digital items. So to overcome that, what I did was tediously encode via HTML a way to structure our collections to look like a finding aid on the website. You see that HTML there in the bottom corner of this. And in the process of that, I discovered that DSpace's formatting did lend itself for me making a sort of a hub to aggregate information. So that's what we did with our Latino digital collections. There's a snippet of it there in the top left of this thing. It contains links to our growing set of digital collections related to Latino history. And our hope is that if you made it to our digital collection site, you're inevitably going to encounter this particular page and see what we got. Also, during our survey of collections and oral histories that I mentioned, we began compiling a list, and there's a little snippet of it there in that center image. It shows the title of our collections, the oral histories we have, links to them if they're available, links to transcripts if they're available. Sadly, it's just a god-awful spreadsheet that we turned into a PDF, but we needed a quick, dirty way to get this stuff on at the time while we looked at something maybe a little more interactive, a little more innovative. Okay, so we had a central digital hub. That's awesome, but we needed even more old-fashioned archival work. So the first place we directed our attention was toward a project we've had going on for a few years entitled our Legacy Finding Aid Project, for lack of a better term. Its goal was to encode the 2,000 or so finding aids that hadn't yet been encoded so that we could share them on Texas archival resources online. That's the Finding Aid Consortium for Texas. This enormous project really helped us, well, it gave us an opportunity anyway to identify any Latino-related collections as we encountered them, which could then allow each of these finding aids that we were making for these to become a mini hub as well via the related material EAD element in our finding aids. We also have a robust social media presence. So over the last few months, we've tried to highlight some of what we've discovered as a part of this project on there. So, using all of this stuff, the finding aids, digital collections, exhibits, social media, we gradually built some of these community relationships. We're learning what the folks that our archives are describing are actually doing. We're trying to listen to their experiences, I hope, and build something more collaborative, what Zach calls the co-creation of knowledge, which I have stolen for the rest of my career. Sorry, Zach. God's a great phrase. So take, for example, these photographs. They depict the Guadalupe neighborhood in Lubbock, Texas. In 1970, this neighborhood was ravaged by an F5 tornado, okay? That changed the literal geographic direction of development in Lubbock from north and east to south and west. This photograph is of a family that was actually displaced by that tornado. So even before these folks were affected in the 1950s and the 60s, the neighborhood had a history of political activism. Some of this was heightened in the aftermath of that tornado. This was also the home of the readership of El Editor and the other periodicals that I told you about. But aside from those publications, in our holdings, surprise, as I told you, there was disproportionate representation of this neighborhood in our historical holdings. Now, nowadays, it has a neighborhood association of sorts. They were aware of Black and Brown in print, and as a result, over the last year in particular, we've been working with willing residents to accumulate oral history, find a home for their collections if they're generous enough to want to share those with us, but also discuss how they want their history preserved. Maybe they want to keep it in their own home or their civic organization or their church. We just wanted to find out how we could help with that. Now, we're not even remotely the only archive to explore how to assist with this, but I think there's a presentation going on in the next room about that. But it was a new avenue for us to help preserve that history. So did any of this accomplish anything? Well, yes, and some of it was actually quantifiable, which our university administrators love to see. DSpace does get some traffic, a couple hundred views since I debuted that page in mid-2022, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it came from zero. So Zach Hernandez and Daniel Sanchez have both accounted for numerous new oral histories, as well as several rediscoveries. Last I checked, this number's gone up since I pulled these stats, but we now have at least 113 total oral histories with the region's Latino community and a bunch more coming. Like I said, that's just been within the last year and a half. We've also discovered at least 30 papers and records with verifiable Latino creators and dozens more that relate to the topics that those collections describe. So we're trying to place mutual subject headings in each of those finding aids, which theoretically, Ontario should group them together, right? Where people can more easily find all of them at once. As that quantity grows, it's been easier for me to make a case to queue up the digitization of some of these collections in preference to our other more frequently used collections. So at the risk of pissing off the Texas legislature, I know that sounds counterintuitive. If more people want those other collections, that's what we should be digitizing, right? But my argument is that from the perspective of this project, if my whole group, Zach and everybody else, doesn't do these for these groups, it's not like someone more traditionally represented in the archives is going to go out of their way to put this stuff on there. So from that perspective, digitizing with this queue is absolutely mandatory. So what about the non-quantifiable, those relationships I mentioned? Well, those are there too. We have the Guadalupe neighborhood, but we have names, lists of so many names that we have to talk to, and many of those have turned into mutually beneficial relationships. So good for us, right? We've done all this work, but we have to build off of that. It can't stop. And one of the next projects we're looking at is one entitled Recuerdos del Ayer, archiving the Latino legacy on the South Plains, and we applied for an NHPRC grant for this. It's going to feature a simple website hub that highlights our digital collections with everything in both Spanish and English. But more importantly, we're trying to establish a simple interactive element to this website. And we also have stuff in paper copies as well that we get to people with minimal internet access. So that people can, I don't know, clarify points, metadata on items or finding aids, bring new collections to our attention, invite us to collect oral histories, or even attend events. We don't care what they want, we just want to know so that we can help them out. And as a part of that grant, in order to attend these events and do these things, we're going to try to hire 2 graduate students and an undergraduate student to visit those groups and to build off of what we're hearing through the site, or maybe failing that, our existing contacts that I mentioned. We got some other one-off opportunities we're working on to try to capitalize on this. We have a close relationship with the Lubbock County Historical Commission. Those commissions are the organizations that put those historic markers on the roadside throughout Texas. We've got a couple of topics for that, but my favorite one is with this guy here, Dr. Armando Duran. He published his own newspaper in Mexico, but it was very politically incendiary. So he was exiled from Mexico in the 1920s. He traveled around Texas practicing medicine until he wound up in Lubbock in 1948, where there was, as the story goes, there was no Dr. Keen on serving the Mexican or Mexican-American population. So he took over his duties from a whole healer, which is just awesome. His whole story would blow your mind. So we're assembling it together to try to work with the commission, who's very eager to make sure this marker goes up. And dude's got a park named after him, so they need to have a marker there, God's sake. There are final few ideas we put up on the old whiteboard in my office to address as well. Reparative metadata, we may all be familiar with this. SSA has done a couple of really good webinars, workshops on that. Our legacy finding aid project has given us a chance to identify a lot of places where we would like to touch up our descriptions to better reflect the understanding we have now of how that community understands itself and wants to be described. Now, I wrote K through 12 education on here, but I don't just mean going to schools and telling students what an archive is, although I'm sure we all agree that's really important. But we also firmly believe something else, and here we go with Texas legislature again. But part of the reason that we don't see Latino job applicants to our archival positions remotely in proportion to the US population might be because of exposure. We reach a handful of students once they're at Texas Tech, but what if an earlier approach was a better approach? I don't know what that looks like. It's a very amorphous idea, but there must be some way to do it. And so we're thinking about it, trying to work into Recuerdos and other outreach plans to see if we can change the future in a maybe more meaningful way, or equally meaningful on that. And then lastly, hiring practices. I'll wrap up by saying I'm lobbying to create a staff or faculty position at the Southwest Collection to keep working on these projects, focusing on outreach, keeping the momentum up by utilizing our collections, as I said, not just related to the Latino community, of course, but the other communities in the region. Because without that, our existing efforts would lose momentum, and I think they could potentially disappear altogether, and that would be a shame. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to Zach Hernandez, who's going to talk a little bit about some specific things we've done in relation to everything I just described. Zach, I'm going to fiddle with this a minute and try to get you up top.
That's fine.
It's mine.
No. Well, but it's fine. It's my fault.
It is your fault. You sure it's going to work?
Well, let me see.
All right.
It's gonna work.
Oh, yeah, we'll make it work. Okay.
Sorry to do that.
That's fine. First of all, good morning. Thank you all for being here. My name is Zach Hernandez, and I'm going to expand on some of the discussions that I'm not showing the right one.
So sorry, that's my mouse. So you're screen sharing?
Yeah.
And you just need to open.
Oh yeah, hit screen share and find the document that we're in.
Hybrid conference. Here. That's Monday. Is that correct?
Yeah. Okay. And I provided a more detailed look at one of the partnerships and engagements with the Latinx community in West Texas. Specifically, I'll be talking about an oral history project with Fort Stockton, a small community in West Texas that the community, the Hispanic or Mexican community, as they refer to themselves, has been there for at least 150 years. My hope is to not just highlight a particular case study though, but tease out some potential implications for community engaged archival work, specifically as it relates to archiving Latinos and Latinx communities in Texas. So I'm going to begin with an outline. Okay.
There we go.
So start with the what and why. What is this project and why are we involved? And a lot of that Robert sort of already hit on, but just to sort of reiterate is that we want the archive to reflect the community that it serves, both in Lubbock, but also the South Plains region and broader West Texas. And two, in order to achieve that, we feel like we need to build partnerships with communities instead of relying on sort of what I'm calling extractive models for approaching communities with a deficit mindset, right? The idea that we're the experts and we're going to go out and sort of educate and benefit from that and those interactions. Next, I'll sort of discuss the origins or antecedents of the project, what led us to working with Fort Stockton, a town of around 8,500 people, and which 75% of that is Latinx. I'll use mostly ethnic Mexican or Hispanic because that's the term that they use there. Then I'll back up and detail some of the practical descriptive steps for how we went about this partnership and what the project looked like at a perhaps very boring and mundane level. And then finally, sort of looking ahead, some of the implications and what comes next. So, what is BioFest? It is an event that began in 2022. It was its first years, except that the organizers and the community members saw it as a rebirth of a festival or a group of festivals during the 1940s that celebrated Mexican independence. And it contained lowrider events, parades, great food, panels, an oral history component is which we were sort of driving, and all sorts of exhibits. And just to sort of give you an idea of the types of exhibits that the community members put up, this one was in the community center, but these exhibits constructed by family members, community members, were all over the city. We're in local businesses, we're out in the streets, vacant lots, homes, and they had photographs, newspaper clippings, journals. This one here was from the Terrazas family, which was a family that we got to interview many of their elders while we were there. And this was an ad sort of publicizing the grand opening of one of their businesses. There's also many that had religious elements, such as specifically La Virgen here, and little reflections that people could take away from these exhibits. So I just want to sort of give you an idea early of sort of what this event looked like there in Fort Stockton. But let's talk a little bit about how sort of we got involved or the genesis of it. First of all, when we talk about a community-driven partnership, what I mean is a project that is community initiated and community organized. Even this presentation today, in large part, is at the behest of the organizers that asked that I publicize the work that they were doing in many avenues as I could. You know, they want us to go out and make sure that people knew that BioFest, even though they had dances and brought in musicians, was more than just a large party for the community. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but they were very clear that this was a historical event. This was about addressing what they saw as historic erasure in West Texas, and a form of the oral history project sort of being a form of counter storytelling, an idea I'll return to here in a bit. But you know, why is it that one or community engaged versus community driven. And I want to make this distinction clear here before we get into sort of the details, but community engaged community engaged projects, in my opinion, in some ways, centers institutions, because universities and private archives are sort of the driving factors of the events. And I think there's a place for that, such as Black and Brown in print, that sort of result in then community initiated projects. But I think community initiated projects sort of have staying power because the communities are much more invested in these projects and they are their strongest advocates, right? They're going to archives and saying, this is what we want from an archive. This is what we want that to look like. And that energy can carry over to benefit the archive as well. It helps bring awareness to the archive as we're out there in the community doing different things. It gives us the opportunity to describe what an archive is and helps create a new audience for the archive. I think the collaborations, specifically with community led initiatives, also helps us to sort of share our strengths. So for instance, the festival organizers being from Fort Stockton, living in Fort Stockton, working in Fort Stockton, knew in terms of oral history interviewees who we should prioritize in these interviews. And we're able to tell us why we should interview them, what sorts of questions to ask them, and those types of things. Of course, even what they wanted to know is, well, what is an oral history? What do y'all need from us in order for y'all to come and do those? And then we also provided sort of the materials, expertise, the means to archive those long-term, those oral histories. So when I talk about the origins here, it's very complicated. But I want to, before we sort of get in there again, adding a little bit more back, is this idea of the past field work that has been done at the Southwest Collection, right? How do we get to the point where Fort Stockton community members pick up the phone or email me or any other people at the Southwest Collection and invite us out and ask us to do these projects? Well, first and foremost, the Southwest Collection has a history of years of field work in that area. Faculty members like, just to name a few, Ty Kreidler, Daniel Sanchez, Andy Wilkerson, who's no longer there, but they have conducted oral histories and participated in public events in and around Fort Stockton for years. And people know in that area what the Southwest Collection is. I mean, just a year before we were invited to go and participate in BioFest, I was out there close to Fort Stockton in West Texas relative terms. A ranch history event and stayed in Fort Stockton because it was the closest place with the hotel. But during that time, took the initiative to go out. Well, my partner, she's from about an hour from there, and I grew up about 2 hours from there. So we know people. When I go to these places, get on the phone, have dinner with people, shake hands, gives us the opportunity to just make those connections. We'll break up. Here's a picture of music at the beginning, and some of the organizers here as they were setting up for one of the opening receptions. There was multiple. So while I put the genesis for this project from the Southwest Collections aspect in these years of field work by various field reps, of course, from the community, and I think this is very important, this is what they kept harping on, is the idea that this was a connection to history. And I brought these posters up earlier, but these are from the events in the 48 and the 40s that they were seeing sort of a rebirth or resurgence of these types of festivals, right? These posters here are actually in the Southwest Collection now. They're the only things that we collected during that. All these other little small family archives that we saw glimpses of in the exhibits, we didn't try to sort of ask them for them or say like, hey, look, this should go into the archive. But these being so old, one of the community members who I was able to interview was like, look, I need these to go somewhere. My family's not interested in them. Would you please take them? And of course we said yes, and hopefully they end up in our sort of digital aspect. So So what is the project looking like? And what did it look like in terms from a nuts and bolts sort of very, what I call the boring aspect of it? Well, while it begins with the email and phone calls, the planning and our involvement really began with the Zoom meeting. Alyssa Stroman, our oral history archivist, and I sat in a Zoom meeting with the project's organizers to discuss what they wanted. First and primarily, we listened. They talked to us about what the project was, what it is they wanted, why they wanted it. And then they asked us, well, what do y'all need from us, right? We mentioned that we needed a quiet place to record histories, first of all. Secondly, that they might want to create a list of people that they wanted to be interviewed, but that it would also be helpful to have a schedule so that everyone didn't show up to be interviewed at the same time on the same day, and then be upset because they had to wait for hours, right? We've had that happen before, and so we've sort of learned from that. During this meeting, we also discussed release forms, the form the interviews would take, and what would happen to the interviews after the events. One of the things they wanted was that copies of the transcripts would end up in the public library there in Fort Stockton. So of course we said, okay, that sounds great. But in terms of scheduling and promotion, the organizers handled pretty much all of that. We offered to help, but they went on TV, they went on newspapers, flyers, social media, people I met there at the events. Some of them had come from 3 to 4 hours away just to sort of partake in the more festive aspects, but they ended up at the screenings and the panels. They ended up at some of these, what the committee was calling educational aspects of the festival. So I like the way that worked. The organizers, and one thing I will note, they reached out to the interviewees. I think in 98% of the interviews that the Southwest Collection does, I mean, for instance, I personally like to make contact. I'll reach out to interviewees. We'll talk about what is an oral history, why they might want to participate, talk about what questions I'm interested in, talk about what they want to talk about, what the archiving aspect of it looks like, what the release form means, all of these sort of details. But the community organizers, even though we sort of offered to do that, were clear that no, we want to reach out to these elders. We know them. We have known them our entire lives. Now that y'all have told us what the Southwest Collection does with this stuff and how it works, we'll take that message to them, right? We'll do the interview. And I think to be honest, I was a little bit uncomfortable with that because a lot of these people, the very first time I met them was the day I showed up and they walked in and we did the interviews. But at the same time, I think that's part of just letting go, right? The community decided, hey, we want to do the scheduling. We want to have these pre-interview meetings. And honestly, I think it worked out fine. I think it really did. So the interviews themselves, this is the lady that brought the posters in and donated them to the Southwest Collection, but she also brought in tons of photographs and journals. She was actually, I think she's 94 years old, if I'm remembering that correctly. She actually played piano at the original festivals in the 40s. So she had a lot of memories, tons of memories, and her family had been there for well over 100 years. She set up an exhibit, so she brought this stuff in, and then in the town, she set up her own little exhibit. All of this stuff is going to stay with the family here. In terms of the space, the community also decided, we talked to them about needing a quiet place free of distractions. The community actually decided to host the interviews in the old Mexican school, what is called the Bud School. All of the interviewees had attended the school, and pretty much everyone there had not been back to that school since they left it, whether they graduated or moved away or whatnot. But as soon as they entered the school grounds, they started recounting stories and memories, talking about their friends that they played with over there, how a teacher did this or a teacher did that. So in terms of choosing a location, I think that it was absolutely perfect for eliciting memories and getting the creative juices flowing. Put simply, I think they could not have chose a better location. In terms of the interview format, the Southwest Collection, we do what we call life histories. We start with some genealogical materials, information, move on to interviewees' childhoods, educational experiences, then talk about things that are related to them. Of course, we always sort of focus our questions on depending who we're interviewing. The questions here, we follow that same format, but the later questions, again, the community organizers wanted to make sure that we hit on their experiences at the school. They wanted us to talk about racism and segregation. They wanted us to talk about marginalization. But more so, they wanted us to talk about community organizing, activism. LULAC back in the 1920s, 30s, 40s was very strong in Fort Stockton. They wanted to talk about local businesses owned by members of the Mexican communities. So that the whole overall vision for them was that, look, yes, we want racism to be a topic of these interviews, but more so, we want the interviews to be about a community that has flourished despite that racism, right? So again, that was largely driven by this. That's Dr. Ty Priler over here, and these are desks in the school. He's taller than I am, so the desks were kind of cramped for him. For this lady and her daughter that showed up, they were perfect. And all of the people sort of brought materials. You know, you can see these binders in front. They are very clear about their history in that area, and they've done a tremendous job of archiving their own family histories, their own community histories. Yeah, I just love this picture of one of the interviewees sort of talking through who's in this photo and why it's important that we know about them. So looking ahead, and I'll wrap this up fairly quickly. I think we have a pretty good idea of what the project was. Some of the limitations. So in terms of the transcripts, we do probably 150 to 200 interviews a year. The community organizers were like expecting the transcripts to be a week or two turnaround. Oh, they're here at the library. Unfortunately, we also have a backlog. So it's about like 12 to 13 months on average, the transcripts. We're not set up to where we sort of can prioritize certain projects over others. So they just go into our queue. My hope is that they've already reached out. We plan to go back in September to have a transcript to put in their hands when we go back in September. Manuscript collecting was another takeaway here. As I mentioned before, we didn't necessarily seek to collect these materials or take these materials away from the family. I think they're doing a fantastic job of sort of archiving that themselves. Some of them did have questions about the sort of, well, what should I do with these photographs? What should we do with these journals? So we would answer those questions. But for the most part, besides those posters and one other larger collection, we made the focus on oral history because that's what the community wanted. But yeah, so I just wanted to highlight this project today. I think it's a part that illustrates an instance where sort of a larger academic archive, in this case us, was able to foster a sense of trust that led us to doing an oral history with community elders and archiving those stories in a way that connected history and culture in a way that was important to the community itself, right? It was community initiated. So in my mind, sort of going beyond this idea of like just a community engaged work. So thank you.
So we'll stop our screen share and I guess it's starting now.
Yep, I took over the screen's chair, so hopefully y'all can see mine now. All right, so thank y'all. My name is Lorinda Wisey, and I'm at the University of Nebraska at Kearney. So I'm in central Nebraska, small town, smallish archive, and I am the first trained archivist at the institution. So I'm coming from a little bit of a different context. And I'm here today to talk a little bit about our Coming to the Plains project, which was a collaborative project that we launched a few years ago. So UNK began as a normal school in the early 1900s and is still really heavily focused on training educators. We are at about 3,800 undergraduates and 1,700 grad students, of which about 14% identify as Hispanic or Latine. Institution itself is 10% Hispanic serving and hopes to bump up to 20%. So in this context, being the first archivist, I recognized that there were a lot of archival silences and that our archives weren't at all representative even of the campus itself, let alone the surrounding communities. So in 2017, I partnered with Dr. Michelle Warren in our Modern Languages department. And she teaches Spanish, and she had been having some of her primarily Latina students' parents come in and share their experiences in the classroom. So she was already engaged in a lot of the community connection and community work and wanted to capture these stories in a more durable fashion, which dovetailed really well with my desire to bring oral history and active collecting to the archives, specifically to work with underrepresented communities. It's also 2017. So in that political context, we wanted to help capture and share these stories within the communities that these immigrants were living in to hopefully spread some awareness and maybe even change the occasional mind by helping show some of the longtime residents that these were folks just like them who had shared experiences, shared dreams, wanted to take care of their families, so on and so forth. So we received some initial grant funding from our campus, about $3,000, which allowed us to first give our participants a little bit of a incentive. So this was just $50 Walmart gift cards given the communities they were in. Walmart was the only guaranteed store that they all had access to. And we wanted to make sure that their time was valued and represented. But the big one here was initial funding allowed us to actually hire and pay student workers. These, we had a few volunteer students as well, but most of our student workers were Latina and were really critical in helping us conceive of and plan the project so that it was meeting community needs. We were well aware that we were two white people from a university operating from a place of privilege, even though Dr. Michelle Warren had fostered strong community ties and engagement. We wanted to make sure that this was something the community wanted and that we were working in a way that would give back to the community. So our student workers were critical. One of them, in fact, shared some of our early promotional material drafts with her family members, and her mom immediately called her and goes, "You can't use the word immigration," even though what we wanted was people's immigration stories because of the association with La Migra and the negative connotations of that. And this was something that, we thought we were just being straightforward, talking about immigration, since that was the topic we wanted them to talk on. But that community expertise was really critical. So in our future stages, we actually wrote in funding for community advisors. And these were paid positions located in each of our primary communities that assisted with a variety of roles within the project and really had a guiding hand on the project as well. So our participating communities were 4 communities in central Nebraska. We'll talk a little bit more about them. So they are geographically clustered. They're all within about an hour of each other, so close in Nebraska, in rural Nebraska terms. And they were all a little bit different in composition. So Grand Island is about a third Latino, Hastings is 14%, Kearney is at 10%, and then Lexington is at about 2/3 Latino. And this is where a lot of our students were coming from and where a lot of our existing contacts were based. So it was both a practical consideration. These are all easy drives to run out for an oral history. And we were trying to make sure we were getting contacts in the cities where the most active communities were. So I'm going to detour into the technical for half a moment here. As you've heard, informed consent forms are really critical. One thing we wanted to balance with this project was the agency of the participants versus the acknowledgement of risks. So I went on a bit of a deep dive down the rabbit hole of how best to let participants have an active say versus acknowledging that, especially talking about immigration status is a potential very large risk for oral histories that are being created with the express purpose of being shared. So we let our participants choose how they were identified. So whether it was full name and the community that they were currently living in, or if it was, we had one opt for just first name and community. We also offered a anonymous option with the, of course, explanation to participants that if they wanted to be fully anonymous, we can't ensure complete anonymity, but we're prepared to do those as audio interviews rather than video interviews to help protect the people's privacies. So we paired this with open-ended questions to really allow the participants to control the narrative and what they were sharing. So fairly standard good oral history practice, and of course the usual caveats to the participants that they were free to choose whatever questions they wanted to answer versus to skip. And at the end of this, y'all will have a link to our project site and the site that has all of the interviews, and we've put up our informed consent forms and some of our other project documentation so that y'all don't have to reinvent the wheel if you're doing something similar. We ended up with 20 interviews total. And this was what we were funded to do. And it represented pretty well a good age spread, variety of amounts of time that they had been in the United States. We had a few 1.5 or second generation folks participate who had been born in the US. But most of our interviewees came or had family in Mexico. That's pretty typical with the composition of the Latina community in our area. But we also captured oral histories from Colombia, the Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Mexico, and then the United States. So we had a pretty good spread and a wide range of immigration experiences. So we did all of those oral histories. Took a lot longer than we thought, as most projects do. And then we're a bit naive in thinking that our workflow might be as simple and as straightforward as this lovely diagram you see. This was the initial one I had created. So do the interview, create an audio file, transcription, review by the interviewee, translation, metadata, input into our digital repository, and then creative projects. The creative projects were one of the funded end goals of our grant, so those had to happen. This is closer to what our actual workflow ended up looking like. As you can see, things stayed simple through about the creation of the audio file to transcribe from. So we did do transcripts first, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But as soon as transcripts were done, we started working on the additional projects, like the video installation that was part of our exhibit and the banner exhibit. And then we also worked on translation. And all of those informed each other. So it was really common to have to go back and, as you were working on an additional project, you noticed there were some transcription errors. So we'd go back and revise the transcript. And if we revise the transcript, crud, then we need to go back and revise the translation again. So it was definitely a interesting experience getting to those final areas. All of our project material is fully bilingual, and this was planned in from the start. So everything is available both in English and Spanish. And our interviewees chose which language they preferred to be interviewed in. So this was both because of the end goals of our project and because some of these communities, the children might or might not be fluent in Spanish, and the parents may or may not be fully fluent in English. So we wanted to make sure that their own communities had access to these materials. So it wasn't just us going in and saying, hey, we want to translate everything into English so that these white people in the towns around you can understand them. We wanted to make sure this was serving both the interviewees and potential audiences. So transcription was done by students working in their native language. This was to improve the speed of the transcription, hopefully. Everybody varies with how fast they transcribe, of course, and hopefully cut down on some of the misunderstandings and errors. We worked with our modern languages classes to begin the process of translation because their goal was obviously learning, and their style of translation was trying to make sure and argue over every word to make sure they got as literal a translation as possible. That was great, but they didn't get terribly far into the actual translations. So we were really, really lucky to have a fully biliterate Mexican graduate research assistant that was part of the project. So she worked with our undergraduate research assistant and really kept things moving with transcription and translation. I ended up reviewing every single piece of written work that came out of the project, and doing fairly substantial editing on a lot of it myself. I am not quite fluent in Spanish. I am decent enough to edit it, and we had folks who got it to that stage. So with any project, there are challenges. Time was a big one here. So we started our project in 2017, got institutional review board approval in early 2018, started interviews, and we did not finish our last interview until March of 2020, snuck it in right as our university was closing down any human subjects stuff due to COVID. And this was because it obviously takes time to make community ties, identify interviewees, and all of the recruitment kind of things, as well as working with 3 busy academics schedules and wrangling students with full class schedules, so on and so forth. Turnover. With heavily student-involved projects, this is always a big consideration. We were really lucky to have a funded research assistant for 2 of the years of the project, and she was able to help assist with onboarding our students, but I did a lot of trainings for students who didn't really end up doing much work, as we've all done, I'm sure, in other contexts. And I've mentioned a bit that there were competing priorities here as far as time. So our videographer spoke very little Spanish, but wanted to get working on cutting video stuff together. So he was able to work a little bit from transcripts, but it was common to have to pull translators and transcript folks away from transcripts and translations to help with making sure he had grabbed a segment that actually made sense of conversation, or working on the subtitling or translation of the video installation stuff, or on my end, looking through banner exhibit materials. So balancing those priorities was certainly a challenge with the project. So a few quick takeaways or recommendations for y'all who might be looking at embarking on such a thing. Document everything. As archivists, y'all are probably already doing this to some degree, but it's extra important when you're looking at project materials that are across multiple languages, a changing project team, and everything like that. If you have institutional access to something like a Google Drive or a SharePoint, I highly recommend that, as everything's in one spot and it makes it really easy to bring people onto the project. And then when you might have stepped away to work on your primary job for a while, and you forgot exactly what the formatting looked like or whatever, that you have those for your reference. Also build in more time than you could possibly think you need for revisions. As I mentioned, into our 4th or 5th draft of the banner exhibit part, we were still finding mostly minor typos, misplaced accent marks, stuff like that. But depending on how important a really polished finished product is for you, build that time for revision in there. And then shared documents are really helpful, especially in keeping students from getting stuck on an area. So if they're translating and the interviewee has used a really colloquial phrase or just something that's not part of that student's particular vocabulary, it was really easy to have them just put a comment in, mark it for someone else to come look at, and then one of us would go back. We'd sometimes meet as a group to discuss, or I'd do additional research or whatever. So like one of these was there was a big debate with my main collaborator about how we translated community college. So, and we wanted to make sure we were consistent, but yeah. And then when possible, have a native speaker do the final review of the translation and transcripts. So in this case, that meant I did a really careful review of all the English language materials. And a lot of it was understandable, but I made tweaks so that it was more readable. And did some comparisons with translations to make sure those were accurate, so on and so forth. So this is just a quick view of one of our finished products, which was a traveling exhibit. So there were 8 banners, fully bilingual, with one side being the original language of the interview and the other being the translation. So some of them end up being all Spanish on one side, all English on the other. Some are mixed languages. This is one of our participants standing by them. There's also a video installation component of this, and these have all been displayed in the communities where the primary interviewees were. So I'll leave you with a quote from one of our student workers who was also interviewed for the project. I think it's important that our stories get told because our voice is all we have to express ourselves. By having it out there, someone is going to hear and relate to it and want to tell their stories. We will create a collective book of stories that are unique to each person. And with that, here are the websites for the project, both all of our interviews and the project homepage, as well as my contact info. I will plop them in the chat as well for those of y'all on Zoom. And thank you so much. I will turn it over to Wendy.
All right. Hopefully that looks good. Everyone can see that. Okay. Okay, so hello. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Wendy Guerra, the Digital Initiatives Archivist at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. Over the course of the past 2 years, the University of Nebraska at Omaha Libraries, Archives and Special Collections has made 21 Voces of a Pandemic oral histories available online. These interviews, collected by the director of UNO's Office of Latino and Latin American Studies, known as OYAS, were transferred to both UNO archives and the University of Texas at Austin, as they were conducted in partnership with the Voces Oral History Center there. Just a bit about demographics in Omaha from an OYAS report. Latinos are the fastest growing demographic in Omaha, and the majority of the Latino community is in the South Omaha area, known as South O. It has 50% of the Latinos in the city, and 3 zip codes just within that area contain 86% of all the Latinos in Southeast Omaha. So this local instance of the Voces project sought to document and examine how the Latino population in Omaha described their experiences during the COVID-19 pandemic. As the digital initiatives archivist at UNO, I wasn't part of the project to conduct and collect these interviews. Rather, I joined the project when the interviews were ready to be transferred to the archives. So today, I'm going to share with you why UNO prioritized this project and the work that was involved in making the interviews accessible online. I'll be sharing some of the difficulties I dealt with, as well as my plans of moving forward. Archives and Special Collections serves university users, the Omaha community, and all of our other researchers by providing access to our collections both in person and online. And we have 3 different collecting areas. We've got university archives, manuscript collections, and then also books and published material. In spring 2021, we revised our collecting policy with a commitment meant to increase the representation of Black, Native, Indigenous, Latino and Hispanic, Asian American, LGBTQIA2S+, women, and the disabled as creators and voices in the collection. We aim to acknowledge and work to uplift these voices that have not been prioritized through historical records for preservation and access. This work is important to creating a more complete picture of history, as we all well know, and in particular, we're focusing on UNO and the Omaha communities. And at the same time that we were revising our collecting policy with that intentionality of increasing representation within our collections, the director of OYAS reached out to the director of the archives about a potential grant opportunity with UNO's Office of Research and Creative Activity called ORCA. There's a few acronyms in here, so I hope we can keep them all straight. This grant was designed to hire work study students and engage them in faculty research and creative activity while also providing mentorship. And the OYAS director envisioned a joint project between our department and his that would involve his soon-to-be transferred collection of bilingual oral histories, the Voces collection. I was quickly brought into the loop as the person who would be handling the oral history collection and also partnering on that grant. So Archives and Special Collections knew from previously working on a large oral history project that to archive and make the Voces of a Pandemic collection available online, we would need to hire additional staff to supplement my time and effort. So the grant recommended by the OYAS director was a unique opportunity for us to secure that additional funding. The OYAS director applied for the grant, fortunately secured it, and this set in motion what I would call a domino effect of us being able to secure additional matching grant funds. This project was funded in part by Humanities Nebraska, the Nebraska Cultural Endowment, and the UNO Library's Eugene S. and Sonny M. Thomas Fund for Innovation. It was really important to us as a department to obtain funds to work on this project. It perfectly fit in our goal to work towards increasing representation in our collections. And it was clearly a meaningful set of interviews that had potential for great community impact. The trio of grant funds allowed us to design a project that began with the OYAS director and I hiring a shared student employee. So hiring the student employee was difficult. It was critical that we needed a bilingual student who also had work study. If you hire student employees, you might have an idea of the difficulty of these parameters.
Okay.
The COVID-19 pandemic impact on hiring was certainly felt in this situation. We tried to overcome some of the roadblocks to short-term employment by offering a higher than typical wage for campus work and allowed remote work to accommodate a student's schedule. Remote work was also beneficial at the time because the library wasn't yet fully open, still due to COVID restrictions. We tried our best to consider the reality of a work study student likely having another off-campus job, and life responsibilities on top of their schoolwork. As it took us 3 months to hire a student. This resulted in us needing to extend the original grant award window, but we did eventually get there, thankfully. So when the student employee finally started, I provided training materials that gave background on what oral histories were, why they were important, and how to transcribe and summarize them. I have a screenshot of that up on screen here. At UNO, we use the Oral History Metadata Synchronizer, or OMS, to present our oral histories to users. So I also had detailed instructions on how to index and sync interviews for access via the OMS web app, but we got started with the basics first. To ensure ethical, equitable access, written summaries and transcriptions were needed for each oral history interview. We had the goal that these would be bilingual. Under the ORCA grant, I was serving in the position as a mentor while the OYAS director instructed the student employee's work for his research needs. Fortunately, what he needed were interview summaries, and I needed those too, so that worked out really well. When the initial ORCA grant funds were spent, after about 2 months of work, the student transitioned to working solely under my direction as a library student employee. So by this time, the oral history collection had been transferred to archives and special collections, and nearly all of the interviews had one-page summaries in both Spanish and English. Rough drafts of transcripts for the English interviews had been created using Otter AI, and the Spanish interview transcripts still needed to be created. And that is another example of just one folder of that work here on screen. Now, since this was the first oral history project that I had worked on that was large, I needed to get a feel for how long tasks took, especially considering that we were working with both Spanish and English materials. So I drew up a plan for the student employee to do a time test of sorts, comparing how long it took to transcribe an interview that had a first pass done by Otter AI, and then one that was created just from him listening and then writing down what he was hearing. The student had already listened to all of these interviews a few times while they were writing those summaries. So I was really confident here. I thought we would be in a really solid place for creating transcriptions fairly quickly, or, at least moderately quickly. However, working within the confines of library employee expectations provided a bit difficult for my student. And his time test revealed that the work took about 2 to 3 times what I expected based on research that I had done, just trying to gauge how long transcription should take. And we had a deadline, of course, of completing a portion of the work within a set time frame for the Humanities Nebraska grant. So I just really tried to adjust course, and then it clearly laid out expectations for progress, giving clear instructions on this is how long we can spend on each interview. As it turned out, my student told me that he preferred creating transcriptions from just listening and writing, rather than dealing with the machine-generated errors that were more often than not created by Otter. And his time did indicate that it was slightly faster. Although I wasn't super pleased with the amount of time that it was taking, I had to trust his time recording. We were working with those Otter transcriptions because that's what the OYAS director had created. I think that there's better options perhaps for interviews that involve subjects with accents, but they had already paid for that tool, so that's what we were using. The student spent about 2 months working on transcription. It was about 18 hours a week, except for when he had other life things, responsibilities come up. But that translated into about 150 hours of work and resulted in 17 transcripts, or about 8 hours per interview, with some time spent finalizing the translations of interview summaries. Now, this time spent on transcription was about twice as long as I was hoping, but it was the first time we were working on such a project, so I took it in stride. and admittedly some frustration about, maybe time management on the student's end. And that was partnered with their reluctance to work on site. This continued to be an issue no matter how many times I tried to address it. So it was a little bit difficult there. At this point, we had reached the stage of spending the funds from our Humanities Nebraska grant, and it was time to train my student on the next step, which was the OHMS work. This is where we encountered a major roadblock. After repeated efforts to have the student work on site and train on OHMS, because they told me that they couldn't follow the written instructions and they weren't interested in a recorded video demo, which is pretty much my go-to for training students. I ended up giving them a new set of interviews to summarize, translate, and transcribe. Fortunately, the OES director had completed a few more interviews in sort of a second round of this project. And instead of waiting to work on them until a later date, I allowed the student employee to continue on in a track of work that he felt comfortable with, while I just tried to figure out how I was going to move forward here. Unfortunately, the situation continued to go downhill, with some time and tasks being recorded maybe less than accurately, with some evasive answers being provided when I was asking for accountability of time. Over the course of 6 weeks, I never was able to schedule the student for training on OHMS, and ultimately had to make the hard decision that it was best that I let the student go. This, of course, is an oversimplification of the matter, but I'm sharing it because it was just a major problem that I dealt with while I was trying to move the project forward. At this point, we were several months behind schedule, and I was also 2 months away from taking leave myself, so it was pretty stressful. Throughout this whole stage, or like all of these stages, I was communicating with the OES director, letting him know where we stood on the project, and eventually let him know that I'd need to resume my work when I returned from leave. Luckily, I learned that the third grant we had offered the most flexibility, and there was not a risk of us losing the funds if they weren't used within a certain time frame, as was the case with our other funds. So when I returned to work in June, it was a full year after I had started this project, 3 months behind schedule in the first place. And I found that I had to focus my attention on migrating our digital files to different storage. So it wasn't until August that I looked at this project with fresh eyes and assigned my regularly funded student employee, who is not a Spanish speaker or could not read Spanish either, to begin work on it. From discussion with the archives director, I knew that we had some flexibility in utilizing those remaining grant funds. So I decided that I needed to do what I could to move the work forward, and I had my student employee begin work on the Voces of a Pandemic collection. It was really fortunate that I had already trained him on OHMS for other work, and he did a great job. So about this process in OHMS, what I'm showing here on screen is the back end. So we use OHMS, and that means that we upload all of our videos to YouTube, which integrates with the OHMS backend here. Once the Voces of a Pandemic videos were uploaded to YouTube, I created records in OHMS, and then I added item level metadata. My student employee indexed the interviews, then uploaded and synced the transcripts. And OHMS provides users with word level search capability and a time correlated transcript or an indexed interview that can connect a textual search term to a corresponding moment in a recorded interview. So our primary purpose in using OHMS is to really empower users to, to engage with the information the most effectively and efficiently way that they can. Not surprisingly, this OHMS work requires a lot of attention to detail, and it's pretty time intensive. Additionally, while we were doing this, we learned that some of the videos that needed to have portions cut to eliminate data that shouldn't have been recorded in the first place as part of the interview for privacy reasons. This certainly was a downside of me not speaking Spanish and also not listening to every single interview all the way through when I started the project. relying on student labor there. We had to backtrack and we had to do some fixing. It would have been preferable had that information been relayed to me by the first student employee at the beginning, but things just didn't go that way. So, it worked out. We made the edits that we needed and we re-uploaded our content to YouTube and moved on. By November, my student and I had finished the OMS work, and the next step was adding these interviews to UNO's digital collections platform. Excuse me. So we currently use a Lyrasis-hosted instance of Islandora 7 to provide access to many of our digital collections, and that is what's shown here on screen. As with much of this project, there were some complex decisions to be made when adding these interviews to our digital collections. OMS doesn't integrate with Islandora, and we weren't using Islandora's designated video content model, so I had to figure out how I was going to present these resources. Ultimately, I decided on a record for each interview that includes a thumbnail of the interviewee and allows us to present a single summary along with some basic metadata. If a user clicks further into the record on that full description tab that you see, they can see a translation of the summary. Unfortunately, just given how Islandora displays things, I was unable to have the bilingual summaries coherently displayed alongside each other. I tried it a few different ways, and I just got these huge blocks of text that nobody could use. So each record also provides a link to the oral history as it's presented in the OMS viewer, and that's the preferred way of interacting with the material. The user can then click through the index to get an overview, or they can toggle between that and the transcript that's synced with video for easy navigation of the resource. We called this project Finish for Now when my student employee graduated, and we had successfully put 21 interviews with bilingual summaries online by December of 2022. 7 of the Spanish interviews have bilingual transcription. The other 14 English interviews have English-only transcription, simply due to who we had available to work on this project. A final interview was never summarized or transcribed by my first student employee, so I put it online without either, and I was just thinking that in this instance, some access was better than none. And while we're calling this done for now, there are 2 additional interviews that have been collected since my student graduated. And then there was one that was just being sort of problematic that needs some attention by the director of OYAS. Archives and Special Collections is currently prioritizing the processing and eventually the select digitization of the OYAS department records in connection with their 20th anniversary this year, along with one of the founders' papers. So ideally, we'll be able to finish the few remaining interviews too, but we will need to hire a biliterate employee to do that. This has been quite an eventful project where I encountered issues that I had not anticipated, and my projected timeline was way off. At times, the collection was difficult to work with simply due to my lack of Spanish speaking and reading skills. Despite this, the relationship that I built with OYAS is really strong, and I'm very proud of the work that we've done. We worked hard to ensure that this collection was as accessible as I could make it using the tools that I had available to me at the time. Users can discover the oral history interviews through our finding aid in Nebraska Archives Online, shown on screen now, through our UNO digital collections, and honestly, even through YouTube, although that won't have all of the extra features that OMS provides. Since the collection's gone live on our digital collections platform, most interviews have been viewed between 130 and 150 times, with just 3 interviews being accessed less than 100 times each. I'm pretty happy with that. Pretty happy is an understatement. I'm happy with that. It's really rewarding knowing that this collection is being used. I look forward to more projects sort of in the same vein, and I'll certainly take lessons that I've learned into the future. I know that there is a new oral history collection that documents the Latino experience with the Union Pacific Railroad in Omaha. It's just waiting to be worked on, so the effort of increasing representation in our collection will continue. Thank you.
Okay, well, I don't see any questions in the chat yet, but if you have them, please place it in there. You've got a few minutes, so if anyone has any questions for our presenters, please ask them. Yes.
Hey, I was interested how you talked about community initiated versus community engaged. And I was curious if, say, you're in a situation where maybe you don't have a connections with the community, maybe you're new to the area. I don't know, maybe how to find out how to get the community initiatives going.
So real quick, did everyone on Zoom hear that, or can someone wait if they could get a question? Okay, good deal. Go. Zach.
That's actually something that I spend quite a bit of time thinking about. I mean, for all, to be transparent, I have roots in that area. I mean, as an undergraduate, I worked in Davis County, just to make money. So I know people there in that area. In Lubbock, I was born in Lubbock. My family's from Lubbock. My mom's family's from Lubbock. I mean, so it's somewhat, I have avenues for engaging community members because I know many of them before I even step into my role at Southwest Collection that other people do not have. What I would say is I would just start with listening, getting to know people just on a human level, sharing a meal, talking to them, shaking hands, and just listening. And first and foremost about what they want, what they need, and then within that parameters, trying to figure out how expertise of archivists, scholars, whatever it is, could sort of help out with those needs and questions. I don't know. I don't have a great answer for that, but it is something I do think about and often think like, well, if someone was to transplant me to Nebraska, well, how would I start? And I think just meeting people, talking to people, listen.
I can actually make a comment on that if that's okay.
Please.
Yeah, cool. So I started at UNO in June of 2020. So everything was shut down, and I was like, how do I start getting to know people? What do I do here? And it was through an affinity group on campus that I ultimately made. I started building the relationship with the director of OEAS. So it's sort of just like I ended up just putting my feelers out and like, how do I get to know people? And he was the one that started sort of making these inroads for me to like make connections with the community. So I've connected with a publisher of, Spanish language newspaper in Omaha. And, we're working on if she wants to donate her collection to UNO. So even though I didn't know anyone, and, it's here we are about 3 years later, and we still are working on that, but it's definitely a work in progress. Not sure if that's helpful. That's my experience anyways.
I didn't mean to like pit community engaged versus community initiated, sort of like in such an easy binary. I think that community engaged projects could then lead or help sort of facilitate the initiated aspect afterwards. Because of course it starts with engaging and just educating.
I think I saw that Shannon Pinsa raised a hand, but it's gone now. Was there a question from Zoom?
And if you're on Zoom, you can also unmute yourself and ask a question. We should be able to hear you.
If not, are there any other questions? So got a couple minutes before y'all run eat.
Okay, one more question.
Yeah.
I'm in a graduate program, and one of the concepts they talk about a lot is MPLP, which I know is more about processing like manuscript collections. But I was wondering, can the concept be applied to any of the projects that you work on?
I like NPLD, but I see its utility. In terms of the archival work outside of oral history that we're doing, we do things neither at an item level nor at NPLD, but at that middle ground that I think a lot of archives use, right? Folder level of description. So we stick with that, and the idea I think behind, let's say if we were fortunate enough to get the Recuerdos grant, the idea we have would be to enhance the metadata of those existing collections that people are encountering. And then possibly the oral histories as well, although we have another department that transcribes that, rather than changing a different archival approach for them. Because aside from these collections, I'm a curator of like 2,500 and something collections, right? So that's not counting the ones that aren't processed, which there are another 1,000. So we want people to give us the information we can to make it more discoverable or better representative of what's going on, and hope that's enough, right? Because it's a question of resources, it always is. Anyone else want to answer that? Oh, we can't hear you. Yeah,
Muted?
I don't know that she's muted, it's odd.
Okay, now
Oh, there we go.
Yeah.
Um, I will say that we prioritize collections that might be from underrepresented or historically groups for more detailed processing generally, because, and we also found that there's a lot of potentially relevant stuff, even going back into the early 1900s in Nebraska related to earlier waves of Mexican American communities in Nebraska that's hiding within series that if you didn't know to look, you wouldn't find it. So some of the Great Depression era relief records, we've actually found a fair number from women whose migrant worker husbands ended up quote unquote abandoning them because they had to look elsewhere for work. So they're applying for relief funds. So I will say MPLP is not great for collections where you really want to engage with the community or to highlight diversity, but any access point is better than none. So if your decision is between doing a cursory description and having nothing, absolutely yes. Put something up there rather than nothing.
Thanks, Miranda. That's all the time that we have. Could we give my colleagues here another round of applause? Thanks all of y'all for coming and putting up with the little hiccups of the first one of the day. Y'all enjoy lunch.